Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Mindful Public Safety Hour, Sue. It's a great honor to be here to introduce you. And Sue, hopefully everyone has had an opportunity to look at Sue's bio online, and I'm sure at some point, if it's not in chat, Robert or John McAdams can pass that information, or Sue will, to you, so you can actually see the program she works with and what she offers. 38 years, it's amazing, of mindfulness practice and facilitation and teaching and programs. It's quite an extensive career. And working with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, CAMH. Those of us who are from Ontario will know of that very well. I just wanted to add one thing more on a personal note. I have the pleasure of being to workshop with Sue before. And for anyone on this call who's here present, or anybody who accesses the recordings, if you identify as neurodiverse, Sue's extensive knowledge and her warmth and compassion and her training, her practices, and the perspectives will support you. And for those of you who are social workers, clinicians, therapists, counselors, or facilitate groups, this will inform your practice. I'm speaking from my own experience, but it will make you more sensitive to this landscape of neurodiversity. And I want to be brief, and I want to give you a deep bow of gratitude for doing this for us, Sue, and a warm welcome. Sue Hutton.
Very, very nice of you, Gary, and I'm really thrilled to be connected with you. And indeed, I met Gary through a series of workshops that I did with a group called the Mindful Society Global Institute around neurodiversity. And yeah, I'm very honored, and I feel older and older, and the gray hairs are coming in more and more, but I keep having to update my bio because, as we get older, chronology keeps, moving along with us. So this coming June 2025, will mark the 40th year since my first 10-day silent meditation retreat. And I've never looked back. So as Gary mentioned, so I'm a social worker, I'm an MSW, and I've worked my entire career in neurodivergent communities. So I've worked in neurodevelopmental disabilities, so with families with a kid with autism, largely with adults who are autistic, and families and caregivers. And I've sort of been, two paths, my social work career and my mindfulness path, because neurodevelopmental conditions and mindfulness didn't really meet until just over a decade ago. So I was doing all of my mindfulness work, embedding my own career in neurodevelopmental services with my own practice, and doing meditation with clients. But everybody looked at me like I kind of had three heads when I proposed the idea of engaging in mindfulness programs with this community. So I was delivering the MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction programs, in the cancer community. I did the training with John Kabat-Zinn, was delivering those in the cancer community who had their arms wide open to mindfulness, and in the education settings. I was helping train teachers to deliver mindfulness in schools, etc. And then I met my director at the hospital that I'm at now, who has a sibling who has a neurodevelopmental disability and is a group home. And I guess it's about 12 years ago now, she really wanted to begin researching what happened when we taught mindfulness skills to staff, or sorry, that came after, to families. Families was the first part. What happened to the well-being of the people that they were supporting? What happened to their well-being as a caregiver when they were looking after themselves? And in Ontario, I'm sure all over the world in many ways, but in Ontario, around that time, the wait lists for services for autistic adults were just horrific. I mean, they still are. So we were funded to research what happens when we help the caregivers who are enduring these long wait lists in providing care for their sons and daughters. And lucky me, I got to be the person developing that curriculum, adapting mindfulness-based stress reduction for caregivers. And that was the beginning. And then, of course, the results, everybody here knows a bit about mindfulness. The results were excellent. The people in my mindfulness study were the groups that I did. Their depression levels came down. In our control group, because this was a randomized control trial, their stress levels went up. And so that was the beginning. And then we adapted that for staff. We adapted that for management and leaders. And one of my favorite things is we adapted the curriculum for neurodiversity. So for autistic adults in particular was the first randomized controlled trial. So we did a Public Health of Canada randomized controlled trial with autistic adults with a curriculum where we had adapted mindfulness from the mindfulness-based stress reduction and made it accessible for autism. That's where my many, many, many years of mindfulness practice and teaching mindfulness turned on its head. And I'll tell you a little bit about how it turned on its head. So I will share some slides, and don't worry, I'm not going to bore you to death with slides, but this is more to keep me on track. I am very open about disclosing that I am not diagnosed with ADHD, but we see in neurodiversity communities more and more that there is self-diagnostics that are being accepted. I feel like I could be a poster child for mindfulness and ADHD because of all the years I've been doing mindfulness, and I've had ADHD symptoms, but with all these years of mindfulness, I really feel like the benefits that my prefrontal cortex and that my brain and my organizational skills have inherited thanks to the mindfulness, that it's really benefited me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I've done, and I'll share a little bit of an overview, just sort of a loose agenda. But in our time together, we'll experience some practices. So I'm going to show you now Gary's old hat at all these, show you some of the adapted exercises that we've created. We'll talk a bit about why we've adapted these exercises and how we've adapted them for the breath practices, how we've adapted them for the body practices. And then we'll explain the importance of why adapting is pretty critical. Then I'll share a little bit about our research findings. And then, of course, time for some discussion and question and answer. And look at that, Gary. So you said 38. So this is the updated version, 39 years. I don't need to say too much because we've already talked about it. But there's also the lens of human rights advocacy, which has been a major part of my career, working in a neurodevelopmental services agency. The last part of my career there, I was there for 30 years, and the last part of my career there was developing human rights training for the staff to have an understanding of the human rights issues for people with disabilities. And I kind of bring that lens into the mindfulness, right? Accessibility and inclusion and principles around access. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So why should we be caring about neurodiversity and mindfulness? I call it the triple A in the groups that I do: autism, anxiety, and ADHD. So a massive amount of the people that we see have extremely high levels of anxiety, right? So with some of these neurodivergent conditions come social challenges, stresses, really high levels of feeling rejection in society. And that comes very naturally with feelings of depression and anxiety. So we know that when there is a diagnosis or not because a lot of people do not have a diagnosis but are autistic. And you can probably close your eyes and reflect and count a couple on your fingers. It's like, yeah, Uncle Joe, there's many people who have not had access to assessments. And it's changing. I'm very lucky to work, as Gary said, with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, a fantastic hospital. And I'm with the research unit that specializes in autism and neurodevelopmental conditions. So I'm really lucky to be surrounded by some of Canada's and some of the world's greatest professionals looking at access to autism assessments. It's just so incredibly important to make it accessible. And the other big thing is that there's so much harm done when mindfulness is taught in a way that does not include considerations for neurodiversity. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. There's an image here that I'm sharing just of a staircase and a person in a wheelchair blocked from getting uphill. So accessibility to me is more than wheelchair ramps. And when we're talking about these legislative frameworks that are emerging globally, I keep thinking mindfulness needs more accessibility measures put in place in the way we deliver it. And to me, it's a human rights issue. Here's a quote, and this is a quote from one of the first autistic meditators who did a group with me. All the groups that I do at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health with our 6-week curriculum, I co-lead with autistic adults. And it's really important to have that lens and that framework there. The first one who worked with me said, Sue, this is great. I'm really excited about doing mindfulness, but if you ask me to focus on sensations of my breath, I feel like there's a noose wrapped around my neck, getting tighter the more I pay attention. That was a fantastic lesson for me right off the get-go of, okay, we've got to adapt how we do the breath practices. So it's really important, and it's such a classic way of teaching mindfulness. Pay attention to the breath. We don't realize we're triggering a panic attack for a certain amount of the participants who are sitting there with us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. First thing I'm going to do is take a look at our own neurodiversity. Now, I'm sharing an image right now that has 2 high contrast images. And again, this is around accessibility, is thinking about high contrast images. Anyone with low vision, this is much easier for someone to see. But you'll notice I also describe the images that I'm sharing, and that's also taking accessibility into consideration in case anyone here is visually impaired. And perhaps I don't know because people don't need to disclose that, right? So there's an image of a hand, image of an apple, and we're going to do a little brief exercise on something called interoception that we're going to talk about today, and exploring our neural wiring. So this is important to me when we consider mindfulness, because mindfulness, I like to call it, I don't know if you've heard this way of looking at it before, turning the lights on inside, right? So we close our eyes, become aware of what's happening inside. And for anyone with any kind of sensory processing overwhelm, which is a condition that happens with a lot of neurodivergent people, we can be asking them to just turn on the fight, flight, or freeze response when we ask them to do a body scan. Trust me, I've seen it many, many times. So it's really important to get an understanding and to normalize for all of us that we're all wired differently, right? Every single one of us who's viewing this video right now is wired completely differently. So let's do a really brief inventory. And what I'd love to ask you to do is just hold a hand up in the air, and just so that it's not touching anything. And if it's uncomfortable, if you have any kind of hand injury, or if that's difficult, don't worry about doing it. But all I want you to do right now is, just in your own way, close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. See if you can take note of sensations in your hand. And there's no right or wrong way of doing this. You're just doing a brief inventory to observe how you're wired. So can you feel perhaps the circulation is flowing? You may be noticing right now that the blood is rushing down a little bit. There may be tingling in the fingers, and there may be different sensations in the thumb, forefinger, middle finger, ring, baby finger, the palm, the back of your hand. And just observing now the hand as a whole. See if you can just take note of any sensation that's obvious to you. And that's all I wanted you to do with that. And you can put the hand down. And I see there's a hand up. Speaking of hand down, there's a hand up. Robert, you have a hand up. Did you want to? Was that your funny way of putting a hand up? You put your virtual hand up. That is very interesting. I don't know if people noticed that. Is that all you were doing? Okay, very, very funny, very interesting. So we just did a little inventory on our interoceptive abilities. Interoception, I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment, is a term that refers to feeling the feels, right? Occupational therapists, if there's any occupational therapists viewing this, are well versed in this concept of feeling sensations, like when we're hungry, when we have to go to the bathroom, when we have butterflies in the stomach, and what we just did there of just observing the sensations in the hand. That's our interoceptive sense, right? So we just took a little brief moment of that. Now what I want you to do, close your eyes again for those of you for whom that's available. And now all I want you to do is we're going to take an inventory of how the brain's wired in a slightly different way. And this time, we're simply going to think about an apple. Okay, so picture an apple or think about an apple. And I'll tell you in a moment why I use that alternative language to picture or think about. And just take note of how the light falls on the apple, and is it a particular shade or color? And that's all I want you to do. Okay, so you can relax, open your eyes. So we just did a little bit of an inventory on our interoceptive skills and our visualization skills. So can you please enter in the chat function or just take note of it yourself? Which one was easier for you? Was it both of the things, both equally feeling the hand and visualizing the apple, or just the apple? And so Jackie, visualization, Christine, the hand, and then Gary, the hand also. Yep. Yep. So you'll note, and then Robert, visualization. Look at that. We're alternating here. And then Patrick, yep, the hand. So you'll notice that it's different for all of us, right? So if I was leading a meditation exercise with everyone and I didn't give an option of the range of our neural wirings, if I told everybody we're now going to do a visualization, a number of you might feel like you're a failure because you can't visualize. It's normal. There's a large amount of the population that does not visualize. And we are all scoring differently on the interoception scale. So these are just some of the little tiny things to think about when we think about teaching mindfulness to people, right? I'm going to share a few more things, and then we're going to do some practices and experience the examples of some of these practices on how we help people find their range and find the way that they can meditate. So here's a little tiny bit, just looking at that visualization and so much mindfulness. There's a lot of the tools that are used in mindfulness that do involve a little bit of visualization. And there's something called aphantasia, right? That some of you may have heard of, the inability to see images that are not there or to visualize. So some people really feel like failures. when they're led through perhaps a loving kindness meditation where they're supposed to picture a person, or where they're picturing clouds in the sky, if they're picturing their thoughts releasing, like a mind like sky exercise, and they just feel lost and like it doesn't work for them, and they drop out of mindfulness programs, right? So it's really important to be inclusive and make sure that everybody knows you're not doing it wrong. It's just the way you're wired. And it's our job as mindfulness teachers to help you find the way that you're wired where you can really connect and benefit from the practices. So I'm going to do a brief practice to help us arrive together. And I'm kind of a wannabe birder. So right now I'm sharing an image of a number of birds on a branch. Perhaps it's in the spring. There's some little buds. And I just like thinking of this when I think of neurodiversity, because we're all wired differently. And they're all birds, but we've got some cardinals, the male and the female, and a gorgeous bluebird, and some other, I'm not sure what they are. The birders in the group can tell me afterwards. But let's do a really brief practice right now where I'll honor the neurodiversity among us, and we'll do a brief arriving practice. So can you come into a position that's comfortable for you right now? And allow the eyes to close if that's helpful for you, just reducing the visual stimuli. And the first thing I'd like you to do is just concentrate on listening to the sound of your breathing. So this means breathing so deeply that you can hear the sound of your breath, and see if you can stay consistent with holding your attention on the sound of the breath. And it may even sound like an ocean tide flowing in and out. So just relaxing the body, softening the brow, softening the eyes and the jaws, spending the next few breaths totally focusing on the sound of the breath flowing in and out. And you may notice that subtle pause in between the in-breath and out-breath. And if you're someone who's wired pretty high on the interoceptive scale, you may also just naturally be noticing the rise and fall of the belly or the chest. And if that's the case, see if you can pay attention either to one, the sound of the breath, or the rise and fall in the body, perhaps the chest, perhaps the belly. And then the other one that I want to invite you to explore is both, blending the sound and the interoceptive, the feeling inside the body. So explore that. You've got those three options: sound, rising and falling inside the belly or the chest, or both, dual anchor. Explore that for just a few breaths. And allowing the whole body to soften even more on the next out breath, letting go and putting down anything you can put down and let go of right now. You may feel the body getting heavier, more relaxed on the out breath. Okay, so there's a very, very brief practice, and you can open your eyes, stretch the body if you like. Love to hear in the chat function what was the best way for you to connect. And by the way, if none of them were, you can say, None of those really worked for me today. But what we just did was we observed the sound, which is an exteroceptive way of practicing mindfulness. It's practicing observing something outside the body, right? So anyone who's more prone to panic attacks, who has more sensory overwhelm inside, we want to offer them an exteroceptive, like that sound. And I'm going to show you a couple more. But what was best for you? The sound, the internal, or the dual anchor of combining them? And just feel free to put in the chat. And we'll notice again, we're all wired differently. So all of us benefit from a different practice. Yep. So internal. Yep. Yep. And then Christine, yep. Good note that Christine couldn't hear much in the breath. Yep. Yep. And then Robert, really interesting, the dual anchor. Yep. Both were visceral, but both were a symphony. Oh, Gary, I love that description. Sound works best for me, but I love the dual option. I really, really love this dual anchor, and I've been doing more and more of it in my practice. And I find with the groups that I do, we haven't, collected data on this yet, but a really large amount of the people with ADHD in the programs that I do love the dual anchor. They really find it a sweet spot to give that intero and extero, having those two anchors to observe. Yep. And then Patrick also noticed I was able to blend the sound with the feeling. Yeah, it's so interesting, eh? Get creative with this. The other thing that we really emphasize in the groups that we do, for neurodivergent meditators, is we get people to share what's working for them, because sometimes people will come up with other ways that are really, really interesting. It's really fun meditating in groups of neurodivergent meditators where everyone's got a really unique way of engaging. So neurodiversity, this term, and I see that it's coming more and more in vogue, which, kind of makes me happy because I feel like it's turning us into a more and more inclusive world. And I feel like we can keep working toward it. So this image of all these birds all around the world, just it really makes me smile and think about the fact that, again, we are all unique and different. But the term itself is credited, Judy Singer is a sociologist, and in the late 1990s coined the term. And in doing her PhD, and there was writings where she was referring to biodiversity, right? And similar to biodiversity, in which there's a range of flora and fauna, it's the same with our minds, right? We're all different. And the definition and the movement these days, as you might be seeing, anybody's on social media, very active in a live community of neurodivergent and autistic advocates, really looking at depathologizing and really emphasizing that these differences are normal. And it's a social justice movement really pushing toward acceptance, which I think is fantastic. I'm seeing it in more and more places, really seeing this welcoming of different minds and engaging in the accommodations, right? That people have the right to accommodations for their neurodivergent conditions. But I really feel like it's important for us as mindfulness teachers just to consider this when we offer groups, because people don't have to disclose, and because it's often an invisible disability, we don't know who is neurodivergent in our groups. So let's try and make things accessible for everyone. Little tiny bit looking at neurodiversity and looking at strengths. You'll notice in the slide that I'm about to show, and I'm just about to pop up a number of different conditions that are considered neurodivergent, I don't have the terms disorder really emphasized here, because we're really looking at moving toward engaging this as a way of being in a condition. Rather than saying disorder, I prefer to say condition. Auditory processing, right? Processing differences rather than saying auditory processing disorder, right? Dyspraxia, learning disabilities, sensory processing. And again, you often hear people, referring to the DSM, that's sensory processing disorder. But in the hospital unit I'm in, we really engage in the term condition. obsessive compulsive conditions, autism, which we're moving away from using the term disorder again, autism, intellectual disability, dyscalculia, innovative thinking. These are some of the strengths, right? Hyper focus, deep authenticity. Now, one of the interesting things, I'm sharing an image right here, which is a woman holding her fingers up to her ears, and there's a few sensory considerations that are common for a lot of neurodivergent conditions: sensation, smell, sound, breath. Okay. All of these different things can be massive triggers for people because we are wired differently, and these can lead to sensory overload. Sensory overload can lead to, first, through heightened sense awareness, where lights are painful for people. I never use a meditation bell because the autistic meditators have jumped and said, oh, please don't do that. It hurts so much, that it can create a jump scare, and it's actually painful for a lot of people ringing a bell, right? So calming down the sensory stimuli we're putting out, really being cognizant of the lighting in the rooms where we're doing it. We don't want to be increasing anxiety and panic attacks in people. Going to offer us a few more options in our breath practice. And how are we doing, folks? Giving a lot of info. Is this information overload for anybody? Anybody feeling like you want to stretch, you need to dance or shake it out, drink a glass of water if you have it or something or other? I always feel like these hour-long workshops are like a whirlwind tour. So we're getting a lot of information because this is a lot of years in the development. And I want to share as much of it as I can because I feel like it's so important for the world, you know? So we just explored a little tiny bit of the sound breath, right? And we talked a little bit about interoceptive awareness and exteroceptive, and how it's important to offer those two things as balancing options when we teach mindfulness. And we can also engage with vision, right? So engaging, and again, of course, this is for those who are blessed with sight, right? Because we need to remember that there are people, and especially if we're doing virtual programs, you might not know that someone is blind on the other end of the screen. So it's really important to make sure that we're using language that's inclusive and honoring all the ranges of being that are with us. So if we offer a breath that engages vision, we'll say for those who are sighted and engage in that. And I also want to show us the lotus breath, engaging in kinesthetic. These are different parts of the brain that are going to be more activated in different people. So we want to provide options that the people in our groups can experiment with all of them. And some will say, yes, that's the one that works with the way my brain's wired. So let's do a really brief little practice going through these. And again, there's vision, there's an image of an eye, counting and feeling, and it just says 1, 2, 3, 4. That engaging and counting, I think many of us have done. And then the sound breath, the ear, and then this lotus breathing with the hand movement. So let's just try a few of these right now. And then I want to move on to a few other things and love to have some discussion with you. And thank you, getting the messages here. Good, that it's appreciative and people are saying this is engaging. Great. Really appreciate it. Let me know if you need to take a breather, or if I'm info dumping on you. I don't want to info dump. So let's take a little bit of a moment right now. And again, we're going to explore a menu of options. So we're going to do a little bit more breathing practice, but what I'd like us to do is now just explore this one with counting and breathing, which I imagine many of you have done many times. It's a classic standby. And then this lotus breathing, engaging in a kinesthetic movement to help us stay focused on the breath. So to begin with, let's just allow the eyes to close if that's comfortable. Or if you want to engage with your vision, you can keep your eyes open and just focus on one object far away and soften your gaze. So using your eyes open if you want, or closed if you want. And just unifying right now the breath and counting. So what I'd like you to do is breathe in and do it in the ratio that works for you. Some people, if I offer a ratio, they'll say, oh, that's too fast for my brain or too slow. So find the ratio that works for you. But often breathing in one in-breath to the count of 4, one out-breath to the count of 4. So doing it so that it's equal. So just try engaging in that for just a couple of breaths, breathing in and out. Doesn't matter how many you count. The objective here is to access the part of the brain that engages in counting to keep you focused on the breath. So don't get tripped up or worried that you're not counting correctly. That doesn't matter. Like I said, I like, and a lot of people that practice with me, like one in-breath to the count of 4, one out-breath to the count of 4. Just try that. Eyes open or closed. Now what I'd like you to engage with is a kinesthetic movement of opening the hand and closing the hand. And again, if you have a hand injury or there's discomfort, don't worry about it. But if you want to explore it, you can think about the hand being a lotus. So on opens, like a lotus opens to the sky, and then the lotus closes when it gets dark. And now unifying the movement of your breath with the movement of the hand. So as you breathe in, the hand opens. As you breathe out, the hand closes. So finding the way that works for you, but seeing if you can get even more focused and have the very beginning of the in-breath synchronized with the beginning of the opening of the hand, and vice versa with the closing. Try that kinesthetic movement with the breath. And make it your own. Now, an alternate you can do is just moving the toes, believe it or not, imagining that you can pick up a pencil with your toes. So the toes scrunch up a little bit like they're picking up a pencil. And then releasing and spreading the sole of the foot out. And doing that in unison with the breath. So breathing in, toes come in, breathing out. The foot relaxes and the toes spread out. You can even alternate like a cat would need a blanket. Cat just stretches its paws out, alternating right and left with the breath. And always releasing and relaxing on the out breath. Okay. So there's another little look at some of the options that we provide in our menu. Feel free to stretch the body. And again, I do want to get to questions and answers with you. I'll just share one or two more things. This interoception idea, so important. And when people come to me for one-on-one mindfulness work, the first thing that I do with them is an interoception scale, where we take a look at a scale and we see how high they score. I, for instance, score very low on the interoception scale. When I did my first 10-day retreat in 1985, I think it took me until day 3 for me to feel my toe, like it's really taken me a lot just because that's how I'm wired. Very high pain threshold, for instance. Other people, I know some autistic meditators who practice mindfulness with me, who, if I ask them to pay attention to their body, they almost yelp out in a scream because they said it feels like there's an electrostatic energy throughout my body, like they're so heightened. So it's really important to explore when we do the body work, right? To explore people's ability to feel the feels. Kelly Mahler is an amazing occupational therapist who does a lot of work. And by the way, I'll send all these slides and all these resources to you so you can have them. So I love working with people who are neurodivergent in little tiny areas of the body at once. So right now, can you just tense and release your hand, right? You might remember the classic called, progressive muscle relaxation, right? So just one body part at a time. And just as we're sitting here listening, can you go through like just tensing up perhaps the shoulders, and then can you release them and just picture them almost like melting ice cream? And then body part by body part, tensing and then releasing. And when you release, picturing it melting like ice cream. So rather than just doing a whole body scan, just saying to someone, okay, now we're going to go part by part, just targeting little parts of the body at once, knowing that for some people, going right into the whole experience could really induce a panic attack. The heartbeat, many of you may be familiar. It's also used in the trauma-informed practices. It's another nice option. Right now, could you take note of whether or not you notice your heartbeat? Some people increase their anxiety with that because they think, holy moly, I can't feel my heart. Am I okay? But just taking note, can you feel that gentle pulse? And if that's there and loud and clear for you, that is a fantastic area to focus on for some neurodivergent meditators. That may be a little bit more of a place to rest. Want to just say a couple of things about masking. So this term masking, or more often now we're hearing the term camouflage in the research. This experience of masking is something we all do, right? So you go down the street and you're having a horrible day and you see your neighbor. How are you? Oh, I'm fine, Bob. We mask. We have to, right? It's something that neurotypical and neurodivergent people do. But masking is an exhausting aspect of life for many neurodivergent people, and it's really got high correlation with mental health issues. People who are neurodivergent often have to mask, and they internalize all this stress in the body. So when we say, now we're going to do a body scan, for a lot of people, it's, oh, that's so painful to think about and to reflect on because I've been so busy hiding from myself. But one of our meditators in one of our groups said, the more I try and fit in with neurotypicals, the more I feel exhausted from masking all day long. I have to wait till I get home, and then I have a meltdown. And then I feel anger and shame. And self-acceptance is hard. So it's really important to acknowledge there are people who are just putting on every last ounce of effort into masking to get through the day. So that's just another element and closely related with mental health in the research in the autism community. Really important that we use language that's affirmative of differences. You're perfect as you are. As I mentioned, I'm really dropping the pathologizing ableist language, like having the term disorder every other word. being affirmative, being non-ableist, right? So no, not everybody is the same, and really celebrating our differences, using concrete and plain language, avoiding jargon. For so many of us, jargon, terms like invitation, which is part of the normal mindfulness lingo, right? I invite you to explore this. Well, for some neurodivergent meditators, they're like, I don't know what they mean by invite. Like, we need to just be clear and concrete. Having use of pictures, really welcoming all abilities in all of our work. That is a whirlwind tour of a little bit of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of decades around neurodiversity and mindfulness. I hope you're not exhausted. Thank you so much for listening to all of that. It's making the world more inclusive is just so incredibly important to me. My son's autistic, and I really want to see a world where there's no barriers, where we welcome everyone, and we provide opportunities for people to grow and be strong and welcomed in their communities. I'd love to hear from you now, like on any questions that may have come up for you, any stories, anything that you want to ask. Let's just turn it wide open. And John, Robert, Gary, if there's any process you want to get into in terms of opening it up, but I'm very happy to open it up and just have a discussion and answer questions if there's anything at all.
Well, certainly everyone is welcome to unmute your microphone, and you can just speak up and ask away. If you would like to type something into the chat, we can, you could send it directly to me if you like, or you can send it to everyone and we can just speak that out. So please do feel encouraged and invited to offer comments, questions. Thank you, Sue.
Oh, of course. And I'll just add, it's an interesting thing. All of the research groups, because we've been studying, and we did a randomized control trial, as I said, and it's been a number of years that we've developed the neurodiversity informed mindfulness with autistic meditators. And next week, is it next week, the 22nd of September or of November, we're starting our very first in-person group with autistic meditators, because all of our groups have been virtual, because we wanted to explore virtual mindfulness as a more accessible thing for people who had so much anxiety about going into groups. And also, it's hard to adapt an environment, to make sure that it's accessible for everyone. Something that's, the lights aren't going to be too bright or too dark, or it's not going to be, just really wanting it to be a sweet spot. So I'm over the moon excited about doing our first in-person group. I feel like we're going to learn so much about making it accessible in a new way. So I'm pretty thrilled. And there's not a lot of people doing this around the world. Like I've done some talks with people in England. There's a group in Denmark that's done some of this, but it's a great area to explore. And are there questions? Don't know. Okay, there are some. Okay, very good. Shall I read these out, or John, do you want me to read them out?
Yeah, you're welcome to, Sue. That's
Yep.
good.
All right. So Jackie, very nice to meet you. Jackie's just saying, I work with teacher candidates. I teach them some very rudimentary mindfulness practices, and I don't go deep because I believe they need to have a mindfulness practice in order to do it with their students. 1000%, Jackie. Yeah, 1000. Yeah, you can't teach mindfulness if you don't have a practice. I was asked to do a 3-hour workshop last week for occupational therapists at the hospital that I work at. And I was asked to help them embed it into their practice. So first thing I said is, you start off with your own practice. And I use the analogy that I imagine everybody here, probably relates to. If I wanted to learn the violin, I would have to spend an awful lot of time practicing my scales and getting familiar with music theory before I went out and did my first concert, right? Mindfulness is the same. right? It's not something that you can just pick up a script and read it and everybody's just going to get it. And right, and I imagine I'm speaking to the converted here, but Jackie, I 100% agree. Yeah, you have to have a mindful. Well, John Kabat-Zinn, who I trained with, the requirement was minimum of 2 years of a daily practice and doing a silent retreat annually. So having a silent retreat under your belt before you step into the teaching realm. Yeah. But I know that I'm speaking with people who are very experienced and do this kind of work. John Kabat-Zinn. Yes, Jackie. Amazing. Amazing. I felt very lucky. I was pregnant. My son's now 17. I was pregnant when I did the training with him. Jackie, you're old like me too, because he hasn't been doing it for a while. But because I was pregnant, he took a very special interest in me because you probably know John Kabat-Zinn's wife is a midwife. So I got to have a whole bunch of meals just with John Kabat-Zinn where he was sort of checking in on me, and it was very nice. And so another, yeah, we're old. I'm not the only old one here. And then another message, very eye-opening, provides me with the opportunity to create widened accessibility during individual counseling. Yeah, absolutely. Like the more we can acknowledge that there's such a huge range of people who are having mental health issues exacerbated by masking their neurodiversity, by thinking they have to hide it. Because if you find out that they're wired differently than everyone else, they're going to feel like a failure. So the more we can welcome and celebrate, the better.
We also have a message from Patrick.
Yep.
Can you talk about the difference between practices to shift concentration between objects of focus and dual awareness intended to help develop interoceptive and exteroceptive awareness at the same time?
Yeah, it's a complicated one. And I'm very much a fan of when it comes to neurodiversity, if you can work one-on-one, all the better. You'll get so much further at helping somebody really feel safe and find the tools that work with them. Because I'm in a hospital setting and I'm a big believer in these offerings being free. So we do them in groups, right? So we find ways and we also do them in individual ways. Have to be careful not to create overwhelm for people with the dual awareness because it can be overwhelming. So always providing the opt-out option, but letting people know that they can explore going back and forth between those anchors. And again, I'll send some links with a couple of practices that you can explore a little bit afterwards. So to Robert, John, and Gary, I'll send a few of those links that you can take a look at. And also exploring what's going to be good for the individual person. So going sort of sense by sense. I like doing a sense check meditation. I used to do the classic eating meditation with the raisin. Is everybody here, familiar with the good old raisin? Which I've moved away from because it's an incredible barrier in the groups that I do with, there's a pretty high percentage of challenges with eating, what we would have called eating disorders, right? And people find it a real trigger to be asked to do an eating meditation. So I've shifted that to doing an inventory of all of our senses, our vision, our sense, scent, and sound, and then we explore combining some dual anchors. Yeah. And I know that we're almost right at the time, and Gary has a hand raised.
Yeah, I really appreciated your comment in the slide with the brain that people don't have to disclose that they're neurodivergent or have any issues. And you also emphasized a couple of times that many of us don't know, we're undiagnosed, or we don't know what specific things are going on. Is there any studies out there as to what percentage of the population may be neurodiverse, and how many of those find out later in life or anything of that
Oh,
nature?
yeah. I mean, yeah, I can't give the exact one, but the term neurodiversity, of course, is just like referring to a wide range, right? So that includes, as we know, all those various conditions, cerebral palsy and autism and ADHD. So we do have stats. I mean, it's getting higher and higher as we're getting better tools and we're getting more access to assessments and diagnostics for autism. Yeah, but I mean, recently, like it's around 15-ish%. I can get the exact one. It's always changing, around autism, but ADHD is getting higher and higher. Yeah. So, however, there's a massive amount of people who are undiagnosed. So even in different mental health settings and intake criteria, places that are offering autism services are now not even requiring a formal diagnosis because they know the barriers are financial and the long wait lists. So often people accept a self-diagnosis. Yeah.
So Sue, we are at 6 o'clock, and I would just first of all want to express so much appreciation for your work and what you brought to us and shared with us. It's just been very eye-opening for me, and I am seeing people in my life who this very much could be helpful for and apply to. And I want everyone to know that Sue, if you're willing to take another 5 minutes and be in discussion, we would love that. But anyone
Sure.
who joined, we are right now at 9:01, and if you need to leave, please feel welcome to take care of yourself and do whatever you need to do. And Sue, if you're willing to take another 5 minutes,
Absolutely.
we will stay.
Absolutely. And I just, if people have questions that they don't feel comfortable asking in the larger group, there's my email. I just put my website on there. But again, I will be sending, some resources and so on to take a look at afterwards. But there's a little bit. Yeah, no, very happy to stay on. And I'm amazed at, what you folks are doing too. I'm very interested. Who is it who's just talking about the, yeah, Rhonda, just talking about, working with those who have been or are currently justice involved and using mindfulness in the individual counseling. It's just so wonderful and so beautiful, helping people really get connected with themselves. Yeah.
Sue, what's really come to mind through a lot of your presentation are the many parallels between what I know as trauma-informed approach to mindfulness teaching and the more specific for neurodivergent. Now, you actually had some really interesting and different approaches, but the the themes of providing choice, the themes of not pathologizing. Certainly, when we go into a situation working with people who are exposed to a lot of stress, ongoing stressors, and primary and secondary trauma exposure, there are ways to provide support through self-regulation skills, as well as sort of more formal mindfulness skills. And anyways, I don't know if you have any comments about that, but I do see so many parallels to the way we're being trained to work in a trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive way.
Yep. No, it's so much similarity. And the other piece to add to that, the neurodiversity informed practices, as we're calling it, really is so closely connected, because the other piece is that with walking around with some of these chronic stresses, right, of masking. So, and again, lots of research looking at masking or camouflaging, as I said, they're calling it in a lot of the research now. So the chronic experience of masking and the harms that does to mental health, and also the chronic experience of living in an inhospitable world, which perhaps there's sensory challenges all day long. So you're perhaps neurodivergent in a way that fluorescent lights are extremely painful for you. Sounds are extremely painful. And again, there's nothing wrong. It's just the way you're wired. So that perhaps there's a lot of background sound happening. That's going to be distracting you. Some of these work environments, these open concept work environments, horrible for autistic and neurodivergent people who really need to focus in a quiet space, right? So there's people talking everywhere. It's very, very difficult. So the stress that that's putting on of having to focus even harder on your work because your brain is picking up different information, bombarding you all day with all this different sensory input. And coping with that just leads to this chronic buildup of stress, which is so similar to trauma. So there's this chronic stress happening with a lot of neurodivergent people, which is like a buildup of trauma. So it's a form of trauma. It's not the same in a lot of the other traumas that David Treleaven's work, addressing serious and Basil van der Kolk, but it's another kind of trauma that people walk around experiencing, this chronic buildup of this just overloaded sensory input. Yeah, totally. You're right on the money, John. It's very, 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 very similar, the trauma-informed work. And that's very good. Susan is sharing here, staying at a pace that didn't make me feel rushed. I'm so glad, because guess what, Susan? I felt rushed. So I'm glad you didn't. I just wanted to get everything in there. But that's really nice to share. Yeah. Anything else? And Gary, thanks for those comments too. Yeah, it sounds like a rich group of practitioners who are already doing this amazing work. Yeah, there's anything else, feel free to share it. Otherwise, love to keep the conversation going.
All right. Well, thank you, Sue. Thank you for being generous with your email address so that people can, if you're comfortable with it, obviously, folks may be contacting you for further, maybe more specifics or just expanding on this. Thank you so much for providing this to this kind of information to the people who are working and when Robert and Gary and I were speaking and talking about how people in first responder communities, whether it's first response in a crisis situation through law enforcement, fire, EMT, or people working in an carceral environment, they're going to be meeting neurodivergent people on a regular basis, right? Yeah. So this kind of sensitivity really is a sensitivity training as well as a mindfulness training. So so just really appreciate that, and wanted to offer to Robert to offer his appreciations as well.
Yes, thank you, Sue. And there were people who I think were interested in the CEU. Just want to remind people to get that information into us if they'd like the CEU. But overall, I love the practice as well. It gave me some ideas about how to teach and present this in a more open, non-judgmental, and aware and sensitive fashion. So thank you very much, and we look forward to learning more about when you send us different stuff, and just an awareness of this issue will be good for me, I know personally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. What amazing work you're doing. So incredible. Well, again, let's keep the conversation going. Absolutely. And just keep making the world a better place, which I think everybody here is already doing. So yeah, thank you so much,
Sue. Thank you. Be well, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Take good care, everyone.
Thank you so much.